Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Bob Plankers, and it's always my pleasure to talk about VCF security and compliance. Today is going to be no different. We're going to talk about authentication and authorization. You might be watching this video out on YouTube. If not, well, we've got a YouTube channel, and it's the VMware Cloud Foundation YouTube channel. I'd really like it if you follow and subscribe, like and subscribe. What do the kids say? Something like that. You know, that works for me as well. We've got a lot of content out there about things, and at the end I'll show you a GitHub repository that corresponds to a lot of it too. But let's get into it. We've got a lot to talk about today. Before we start, I always talk about this disclaimer, and I'm probably weird in that way. But it's a really good reminder that context is really important in security, and the context changes between your organization and the sort of idealized world I have on the vendor side of things and what another company might want to do for their security. And so it's possible to have too much security. It's possible to have too little security. And I'm hoping that what I suggest is just right. But yeah, I don't know. That's up to you to figure out. And so important. And my goal today is to plant the seeds of ideas how to change your organization's infrastructure so that you're more resilient to attack, you don't suffer breaches, and identity and access control play a big part in either preventing or allowing breaches to happen. And to that end, this is all a true story. All of this stuff comes from years at this point of listening to customers talk, thinking about ways, think like an attacker. We need to think like an attacker. I try to think like an attacker too. And we see in the news, public news reports and of breaches and things. And I feel for those companies, that stinks. But the nice thing about public reporting is that we can learn some things. We can all collectively learn some things. And so as I see stuff, novel things that attackers are doing, all that, I put them into this list. And this list is not meant to be a how to set up authentication. I'm not the documentation. I'm hoping to talk about why, and what you might think about, and design principles and things like that. The level 200, level 300 sorts of stuff, as we usually describe at VMware. And along those lines, VCF has done a lot of work. vSphere, we've done a lot of work to enable Identity Federation. And Identity Federation, it started in 7, vSphere 7, got a lot better in 8, and then now in 9, you can connect to any identity provider that speaks SAML or OIDC. And that's really cool. That allows for some interesting design things. And we'll talk about that in a few slides here, towards the back half of the presentation. But a lot of flexibility there. And that's the way we get MFA. That's the way we get a lot of features. And so, let's use those features to help defend against the things that we see attackers doing. And so let's get into it. It all comes down to trust. Trust is really important. And we talk about zero trust. In the industry, people talk about zero trust network architectures, all of this stuff. But organizations don't like change. And actually implementing zero trust, well, one, it's change. And two, you got to have a hard conversation about things like, you might have to, it's going to look like to some groups in your organization that you don't trust them anymore. And you shouldn't have trusted them to start with, is the argument. But with IT infrastructure, we need to do some things differently. And so I see a lot of zero trust designs come across my desk. Hey Bob, take a look at this. And I look at them, and they've gotten more complicated than the original the original stuff. Well, that's how zero trust works. No, that's more attack surface. We want to keep it simple. We want to have less trust, not more trust. And more components means more trust. And especially out in the public cloud. The public cloud requires an immense amount of trust to use it, because you've got no control over any of it. And anything below your guest operating system, if you're hosting things out in the cloud, that's, you got to take it at their word that they're doing the right things. And Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not, and doubly so for identity providers. You know, you don't know what the back end looks like there and who's got access to it. And so, for the most part, things are reputable, but you know, it's the defender's dilemma too. The defender's dilemma is where attackers only have to get lucky once, but the defenders have to be on their game at all times, and that is tricky. So before we get into it, I want to talk about trust, and I want to talk about trust of identity providers in corporate settings and enterprise settings and all that sort of stuff. But I want, if you're an identity person watching this, I want you to know, I love you, man. You know, this is not an attack on you. I'm not saying that you're not doing an important job. I'm saying that you're doing a hard job. And you've got a lot of attack surface to defend against, and or to defend. You've got a lot of stuff going on, and if you get it wrong, there's a breach, you know. And so what we're gonna talk about here in the rest of this video is how to do some separation of that. How do we work with you to do this? But I just want to acknowledge up front that you've got a hard job, you know. And so, but identity providers, you know, we place a lot of trust in identity providers when we connect to them, and especially if we use them for authorization as well, not just authentication, which is me saying, proving that I'm Bob, you know, but authorization. Bob gets to be administrator in VCF, that sort of thing. And if we let the IDP, the identity provider, do both of those things, anybody who runs that identity provider can do a few things to us, and that's one, change a group membership. The ubiquitous VMware admins group that every Active Directory has ever had. You know, whoever runs that Active Directory, or whoever has got the ability to change groups too, you know, and that's not necessarily just a domain admin, can add somebody to that group without your knowledge, and then they can log in. They can reset passwords. They can disable MFA. So think about it this way. You know, I leave for a 2-week vacation off to, you know, some place with beaches and umbrellas and their drinks and things like that, and I don't take my laptop. That's an opportunity. Somebody who runs the IDP could reset my password while I'm gone, could change the MFA stuff. They could even blame it on me. Oh, Bob called and he left his thing, he left his stuff at home, but needs to get in, so I changed it for him. You know, they can cover their tracks, disable logging, screw up logging, set the fire, even if they don't want to disable logging, which might be noticeable on a configuration management system. They can add a firewall rule to block logging and log forwarding and all that sort of stuff. There's lots of tricks to be played there. But conversely, identity providers have to trust an enormous number of people as well, you know, and systems. And again, anybody who runs these systems, they're trusting them. So a provisioning system, monitoring systems, EDR systems. EDR systems, unfortunately, are not a hypothetical attack vector. You know, it seems ironic, and maybe it is. Maybe it's just unfortunate. I don't know. I'm thinking of the Alanis Morissette song. Isn't it ironic that none of the stuff in there is actually ironic? Regardless, we can talk about that some other time. The EDR systems, monitoring systems, all that stuff. Organizations like to think about one size fits all because it's mentally easier. There's less mental friction there when one size fits all. We all do the same thing, you know. So we're all going to join the provisioning system. We're all going to join the monitoring system. We're all going to join the EDR systems, and that's a recipe for disaster in some cases. Because there's no isolation there. EDR systems have got root access. Well, so do a lot of these provisioning systems do too. They have to change the system, and so. Yeah, but identity providers, all these folks have to trust other people that they didn't get to pick. You know, they have to trust human resources in that regard, hoping that they didn't hire a North Korean IT person or something like that. Help desk staff, support staff. You know, in large organizations, it's not the identity team that's resetting passwords. It's going to be the help desk and stuff like that. And so, lots of stuff in the news. So this started late 2023, the Las Vegas breaches, where an attacker looked up some people that worked for, well, MGM Grand, and it's all public. I don't talk about private stuff. And looked up the Okta administrator on LinkedIn and used his information to impersonate him to call the help desk, their help desk, and got them to reset the password. And at that point, it was game over because the guy's the Okta administrator, and so not good. But that was sort of novel. But the problem is that all these attack groups, these threat actors rather, all learn from each other. And so now we've got Scattered Spider and BRICKSTORM and all of these other crazies off doing the same thing. And BRICKSTORM's come up in the news as of a few weeks ago here. They're not just a ransomware group; they're actually industrial espionage. And so, thinking about you may not even know these people are there for a long time. That's one of their goals. And so, how do you catch that? How do you catch the initial access? Did they call the help desk? Did somebody call the help desk in the past? Tricky, but. Moving on here, underlying infrastructure. They also have to trust us. And you might go, what? We're totally trustworthy. Yeah, absolutely. We're totally trustworthy, just like they're totally trustworthy. And we shouldn't trust each other at all if we can help it. And so that's where we're at, really. Why for infrastructure, we need to dismantle these trust relationships and really examine them, because that's what's being used to breach our environments. One thing that we can lean into, though, and whether an organization chose this or not explicitly, but VCF admins already have privileged access to all of the organization's data. And maybe the organization hasn't thought about that, and hopefully they don't think too hard about it, because that might be interesting times there, but it's true. And you can do whatever you want. You can clone stuff. This is what I meant by trusting infrastructure is there's all sorts of gnarly things you can do to the data that's stored in VCF. There's also, and the workloads and all that stuff. You can clone the workloads. You can take a copy of them, and there's some defenses against that. But we already, as VCF admins, have privileged access to this data, so we can lean into it. And likewise, IDP admins already they're implicit admins of everything in the organization, and anything that's attached to the IDP at least. And so that's a really powerful thing to think about too, because a lot of organizations think about it. They're not in scope for a lot of compliance stuff or whatever. They should be. They absolutely can be the admins of anything that's attached to them, because they can, even if they don't have it set up that way right now, it's just a couple of clicks away. Backup admins too. I'm going to throw backup admins under the bus with the rest of us here. Backup admins have preferential treatment or preferential access to the organization's data as well, and they can restore it somewhere. You think, what are they going to do with it? They could restore it somewhere that isn't the original spot, and doesn't have the security controls. In fact, there's been a number of vulnerabilities like that, where attackers have been able to recover things out of restored backups, debug things, stuff from troubleshooting, data dumps, all kinds of stuff, authentication tokens especially, been able to recover them out of things like backups. And these tokens have a long lifespan, so they've been able to use them to log into other things. And so it's something to think about. It is very scary, all of this stuff, and eventually you have to trust somebody. And so what do you do? CISA actually has an interesting webpage on this, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the U.S. federal government. Insider threats, something that banks, I've known a number of bankers and financial firm folks over the years, and their anti-fraud stuff is something that we could learn from in IT. And CISA's got a lot of that stuff on their webpage. So if you just search for CISA and insider threat mitigation, you'll find this page on your own. In the end of this all, though, end of the day, as people say, infrastructure is different and needs to be treated differently because it's more important. And, you might say, Bob, that's a really elitist attitude. Yeah, maybe. I'm not going to say no to that, but we're different, and we need to be treated differently, because if somebody gets in these infrastructure layers, whether it's, and this isn't just vSphere or VCF either, if they get into the network, that's trouble. If they get into well, the networking, the management side of things. They get into the management side of anything, especially backup systems and whatnot. Backup systems are even more important because they're our last line of defense. And so to that end, what I'm going to propose here is a little bit like building a castle. And building a castle is not zero trust of me, zero trusty. Zero trust is really about always verifying, never trusting. Castles have some trust, but we want to work towards less trust, right? And so how do we do that? And castles are a great model, in my opinion. They've got air gaps, that moat there. It's usually a water gap, but in this case, it appears to be drained. I don't remember which castle this is. I'm sorry. I think it's in Spain. It looks like from the flags, it's in a Spanish castle. But the big walls. The big walls are a nice defensive thing, and we can build those in IT infrastructure as well. Known access point, the moat, not the moat, but the drawbridge. And then the drawbridge has got monitoring, people up above that, if you're not the right person, you get boiling oil poured on you and things like that. Big doors, all that stuff. We shouldn't follow the castles model inside. Most castles, or a lot of castles, don't have a whole lot of internal structure to them. So once you're in, you're in. And that's not the greatest model either. But we can look at the outsides and say, hey, I want that for my environment. And so to that end, I've got a list of 16 things, I think 16 things, the suggestions. And again, planting the seeds of things. Some of these are going to be harder than others. Some of them are going to be things that you can do right now, baby steps. Everyone can lead from where you're at in the organization. And even if, you don't have organizational approval to do a lot of this stuff, to make sweeping changes, one, you can think about that in the future as you design new environments or retrofit environments. Two, a lot of the smaller stuff, especially for security, you can always justify it. Hey, I was reading this report on scattered spider, and it suggested some of this stuff. And hey, the VMware guys, Broadcom now obviously, but the VMware guys said that these are good ideas too. Maybe we should do them. Just a thought. Organizations are hard, but isolation from corporate IDPs, the enterprise IDPs, the centralized IDPs, this is a key one, because if something happens to your corporate environment IDP, then everything is breached, and you want some separation there. This is increasingly popular. It's being called for in a number of regulatory compliance frameworks and things. A couple of different ways to do this. One, if you're using a cloud IDP, something I'm going to pick on Okta. I'm not endorsing Okta, Ping, Azure AD, or Entra ID, whatever. They're all fine. Cloud IDPs are good, but you could create a separate tenant for IT infrastructure for yourself there, and you could create a separate instance if you've got on-premises stuff, or maybe you are using a cloud one, and maybe you create a separate on-premises one again behind the walls, inside the castle walls that only your infrastructure can talk to. And maybe you cluster it. Maybe you've got two sites, a primary and a backup for DR or whatever. Maybe you cluster them so it's the same in both places, and you've got some availability stuff going on there. Maybe you separate them completely, and this is an interesting thing. Should your DR site really be tied to your primary site in any way? Because, if something happens to your primary site, the ability to creep into the secondary site, that's devastating too. So something to think about there. But the cloud, some notes about the cloud one. The public cloud, I was mentioning this earlier, that has a whole class of risks to it. There's always a public front door, for example. You can't put a wall around it. It might still have the same global admins in Okta, even if you've got different tenants. Maybe there's somebody above that. That person has got to be trustworthy for all of the stuff. But, in the grand scheme of things, just explicitly choosing where you're trusting and knowing what you're trusting and who you're trusting, that's a huge step forward too. So, not saying it's bad, just pointing out some stuff. Complete separation between sites seems interesting, but from an IDP perspective, it might only be useful if the rest of everything is isolated too. And when you start doing that, you might even reach a point where the complexity, and don't get too complicated. Don't solve for problems you don't have. I guess what I'm trying to say is, because it makes admins' lives more complicated. It's a drag on them. Admins, we do take shortcuts ourselves as well. We will reuse passwords and things like that. And we know we're not supposed to. But yeah, and so just if you can limit that, and that's one of the powers of single sign-on is that it's one password to rule them all, but we can get them, yeah, we can, there's a balance there. Password vaults, all of us use password vaults. Password vaults are attackable surface as well and need to be considered in all this trust too, especially the cloud-based ones. And I know there's end-to-end encryption in them and that, but it's one of those things, unless you've examined the code yourself, and maybe not even then. There's been a lot of examples of the many eyes make bugs shallow sort of thing doesn't work. That I think about that Linux elevator disk subsystem elevator bug that was in there for decades that many people had looked at, and so, yeah, again, tough problem. You got to trust somebody, though. Reducing audit scope. I mentioned this earlier. If you need justification for this is basically, zero trust is basically just reducing scope. And this is a compliance term. Compliance, if you've done compliance, regulatory compliance sorts of things like PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry's data security standard. Yeah. Maybe you don't want your entire environment to have to follow those rules. Probably, it might be a good idea, actually. But for the sake of an audit, maybe you don't want all of that. So you just sequester those workloads on a separate cluster that's in scope, and then anything attached to that cluster to manage it is then in scope. And that act, separation like that is reducing scope. Instead of having to evaluate the whole enterprise, you just evaluate this little piece over here. And same sort of thing is what I'm proposing with this isolation. We've got two different silos. We've got the IDP admins and we've got the VCF admins. And I'm not saying do some silo busting or anything like that. I think silos actually serve a purpose in organizations because, you can't, there's groups that need to specialize. And having a group that's all together, either you don't specialize or you spend a lot of time hearing about the specialization all over the place. And people, it gets old. You got other things to do. That's that guy's problem over there. But IDP admins and all their infrastructure, there's a lot there. What if we could merge them together and just lean into the fact that VCF admins are already authorized to have access to all of the organization's data? And maybe, and VCF admins are smart, we can run our own IDPs and all that stuff, but maybe you don't want to. And and so maybe we turn this into what I'm calling kind of a tier 0 service admin group, and you take one person from the IDP team and say, hey, come over here, come to the dark side, we want you to help us build an IDP, but we don't want to run it, we don't want it attached to anything of the corporate stuff. We want you to help us implement best practices over here. And basically help us set it up, help us run it on a day-to-day basis perhaps, and hopefully that shouldn't be a whole lot of work once it's set up, but don't invite all your friends. It's just going to be you, and you can do this with network and storage and all that stuff. And this model worked for me in the past when I was a customer back in the day and setting up teams to support virtual infrastructure. We did something very much like this and it was successful. And this is how you trust somebody. You have to trust someone eventually. You can make these people the trustworthy folks. And then inviting other people in like that, you can get some separation of duties. That's one of the problems with having one team do everything is they're already, separation of duties where you have to go to somebody else to get something done helps with fraud, really helps prevent fraud. Because if you're going to do something questionable, you either have to convince them to join you in this effort, and have a small conspiracy going on there, or you're going to get busted, that sort of thing. And so there's risk there. And so separation of duties is a really important security concept for that reason. But you've got a small team, you don't have that separation. Maybe you can, again, balance it out a little bit there. And if you just think that I'm suggesting stuff just randomly here, I'm not. This stuff, we've been suggesting this for about 6 years now, but It's starting to be mandated in the UK, like the UK Telecommunications Security Code of Practice. My friends at the NCSC in the UK have written, and it's a terrific piece of regulatory compliance material. They're a terrific checklist for things. But other groups and security-focused organizations like Mandiant have written about this explicitly in their guidance. They've got guidance about hardening vSphere against scattered spider, for example, and they mention stuff like this. So you can check those out. Second on my list here, if it's reasonable, do your authorization inside the application itself, VCF, vSphere, and not inside the IDP. And this isn't a hill I would die on, and if you've got an isolated IDP, it might not be worth it, depending on who's got access. But if you do authorization inside your app, then you protect against somebody just being able to add themselves or add an account to a group without your knowledge. Otherwise, if you've got and this is something, if you do end up having to stay attached to a corporate IDP that's shared everywhere, that's used by everything, I would really consider doing this, because that adds a layer of protection there. Sure, the IDP people can still, rogue admin, whoever in the IDP can still reset your password, change your MFA stuff, but that's more detectable. When I get back from my vacation, I'm going to notice that I can't log in, and then I'm going to go hunt it down, and then somebody's going to look in the logs and go, oh, what's going on here, guys? So that's more detectable. Something to think about. Use the identity broker. I already mentioned this a little bit. This is how you get MFA. There's not MFA right now at the lower levels of the products, root, at administrator, at vSphere.local, things like that, because it's a dependency loop, and we're worried about that. And so you change those passwords to something long, and you hide those passwords, and you log in through vCenter, you log in through the identity brokers, and then you can have multi-factor authentication. Our vision is to try to get out of the IDP business and just federate with modern IDPs. Modern IDPs do so much better of a job at being an IDP. And so if you need a good on-premises one, Symantec VIP, talk to your account team. We can definitely throw it into if you're renewing or something like that. But anything SAML or OIDC, we can talk to that now, not just Enter ID, Ping, Okta, all of those. If you're still if you're still on 7, you need to upgrade at this point. If you're still on 8, that's fine. You've got options in Okta, Ping, Enter ID. You can still do Active Directory and Open LDAP, the LDAP-S sort of stuff. Please do LDAP-S and not LDAP. But this setup is nice. We started this in this Federation model in 7, got better in 8, 9 now. You can deploy it. It's built into vCenter. That's the embedded identity broker. But you can deploy it as a separate appliance, a singleton separate appliance, and just a VIDB or VCF SSO is what it's called in VCF operations. Or you can deploy it as a cluster of 3 nodes for high availability there too. And so that's nice. You can only have one IDP configured in SSO for the management components, but VCF Automation has multi-tenancy and can use multiple IDPs there too. VCF Automation is really meant to be the front door. Moving forward here, it's going to be the front door for workload admins. So we can really get a separation between workload admins. You get automation, you can get the consoles and do all your stuff over there. And us admins, we get all this stuff, and you're not invited in. That's the castle model. So pretty cool and good directions here too. It's an evolving space, so stay tuned there. A couple of notes about this though. One, so our documentation over the last few years has been interesting. I think we've got it cleaned up most of the way now. So it's not suggesting you put your infrastructure on the internet. I think it may have even said that explicitly. You need to get Okta and Ping and all these things to connect to your Active Directory, or not to your Active Directory, to your vCenter server. But don't do that. You don't drill any holes. Don't let the internet in your firewall, at least. Don't let the internet through your firewall to vCenter. You don't want that. All of these services have a local proxy. you can run. It's an appliance. You download it. Yeah, another appliance, but you can patch it. You can put it on for Entra ID, install it on a Windows box, and you can patch it just like normal, whatever. And then you connect to that, and then that handles the outbound connections there. So yeah, don't put your stuff on the internet ever. The internet is a bad idea. It's evil. Yeah. So only half joking there. Number 4 on my list, restrict access to vCenter and VCF operations to only those who need it. So vCenter has got privileged access to ESX. VCF operations has got privileged access to vCenter. And so let's think about these things. Organizations like to place these on separate network segments, but should you really do that? Or should you just treat it as all one security boundary and put it on one management network? And I like that model, and I'm going to tell you why. It's because I don't trust firewalls, so you put vCenter on a different network than ESX. vCenter is an essential component of all these clusters, and so now you've got latency. They're always communicating. You've got latency of firewalls always examining those packets going back and forth. You might get a rule set update. Not that I'm bitter about that rule set update many years ago that changed the definition. Next gen firewalls often have a application definition, so you can say this is vCenter traffic or whatever. But all of a sudden, stuff stopped being identified as vCenter traffic, and so it stopped. And I would urge you to not use those definitions. Use the actual ports and protocols, 443 TCP, that sort of thing. And just simplifies things. Anytime you're trust. Anytime you're trusting somebody else's definition of something, that definition could change. You don't know who you're trusting there. And so, but from a security, a castle perspective, a wall around our important stuff, I think putting vCenter on the same network is about the same from a security perspective. If you're letting somebody into vCenter, you're basically allowing them to be an attack vector for the whole cluster. So treat it all the same. And on that note, VCF operations. So this is a conundrum too, because you might want workload admins to be able to get in here. This is actually where automation is helpful too, because it can expose all of the stats, performance, and all that stuff in there too. And so you don't have to worry about that and worry about people logging in. So VCF operations, like I said, has got privileged access to the whole cluster too, to do lifecycle management, fleet management, configurations, monitoring, all that stuff. And it needs access in order to do that. So should we put it inside the walls, or should you create separate zones for it? Maybe you've got an outer keep in your castle and you could put it there or something like that. But that's a design decision for you. But just keep in mind, anytime you put a firewall or something there, you introduce latency and you introduce a failure point. So 5, restrict direct access to ESX. Drive all your access through vCenter and the role-based access control model. And that's pretty self-explanatory. There's only a few people that would ever need to get to the management interfaces on ESX, and so don't let them. Many organizations let everything talk to everything, and that's we need some internal controls there. And I always said, basically, if you're not going to get a phone call at 3 a.m. to fix something, you don't get access to vCenter or ESX. And I'll talk later about how I had to soften that a little bit, but that was generally the way I wanted to go. I wanted to drive workload access through their RDP and SSH interfaces so that they would be subject to IDS, IPS, all that stuff. Yeah. But you will need, don't lock yourself out either. You will need access to ESX from time to time. Think about if it's all off for some reason, and if it's all down, whatever, you might need to log in and turn on vCenter again, turn on VCF operations, stuff like that. And so, yeah, don't lock yourself completely out. There is such a thing as too much security. Number 6, restrict access to other connected infrastructure systems management interfaces too. And I should actually explicitly point out iDRACs, ILOs, all that stuff, those are out of band. You need to have the same level of protections for those things too. And those things for your IT infrastructure, those things can't be connected to corporate infrastructure either, because then that becomes an attack vector as well. A backdoor. A lot of those things have backdoors. We've got in our hardening guidance some advice on how to deal with those, But yeah, just keep in mind everything that's connected. Backup systems, especially, too. All of this guidance goes for all of IT infrastructure. Really, it's not VCF specific in most cases. Service accounts reduce their permissions to the minimum needed. Least privilege on service accounts, and this is hard. This is sysadmins. We lie to ourselves. We tell ourselves, "I'm just going to get it working, and I'll come back and fix it later." No, you're not. And I'm talking about me. You're better than me, I'm sure. But, this was me. I always had this endless stream of fires, and this thing isn't burning, and so I'd never get back to it. And it'll only be burning after a breach comes. It's breached, there's a problem there, and by then it's too late. So do it right the first time. Take a little time to set these service accounts up correctly the first time. If you've got backup software, ask your backup software for the documentation on what permissions they need. That can be helpful. If you need to figure it out yourself, there's a couple of different ways. One, there's a permission recorder. It's a little unwieldy, but we've got documentation on how to use it. You need a vCenter that's not busy, because what it'll do is it'll record all permissions being used over the course of however long you've got it enabled. And so if there's other things going on, you'll get all that stuff in there too. So you really need a test vCenter. But those are easy to deploy. They're just VMs, right? So you can deploy a test vCenter, try your thing, and then and you can run ESX in nested in a VM too if you need an ESX host attached to that test vCenter there too. Try your stuff and then shut it off again. Or what most people use is, so vCenter will tell you what permission is missing if you try something and it fails. So it's usually like folder.create or whatever. It'll show it in the activity log. So you just set up a login. I did this not that long ago, and it's tedious. But what you do is, but you only do it once, right? And so you set up a login that's got read-only access or just a little bit of permission. Then you try what you're going to do, and then it fails, and then you fix it. You add the permission. You try it again. It fails. Wash, rinse, repeat. You're going to do this for an hour of your life, and it's going to be the boringest thing for an hour of your life. And then you're going to be done, and it's going to be perfect, and you won't have to worry about it for another 10 years, and that's the beauty of that. So, and remember to test everything. So backup systems, make sure that you've got permissions to restore stuff if that's of interest to you. And maybe it's not, maybe you don't want people to be able to restore or something. And that's fine too, but just make sure that whatever use cases you've got, you've tested them. Number 8 on my list, enable IDP's advanced features. So all these modern IDPs have got cool features like conditional access, you can say, and I guess most of this other stuff is conditional access to some form of it, but geographic location. Like Bob can't log in from his vacation in Tahiti or wherever the heck I am, or I just logged in there and now I'm logging in from Wisconsin and now I'm logging in from Northern Illinois. Hey, there's something wrong here, and that sort of thing. Turn those features on. Phishing resistant MFA, that should be turned on, that number matching stuff. It helps. MFA is not perfect, but stuff like that helps to prove that the right human is at the authenticator on the other end. Device hygiene. Hey Bob, you haven't patched your iPhone recently, and so we're not going to let you in until you do that. You might be compromised. Things like that. Turn those things on. They are your friends. Turn access logging on and retain those logs for as long as you can. And one of the things that's come out of various security reports, so some of the stuff about BRICKSTORM lately and Scattered Spider, and Mandiant mentioned this, is they call it dwell time, basically the amount of time between the initial access, the initial entrance of the attacker into your environment, and then to detection. They call that dwell time. And I like that term, dwell time, and the average dwell time was 393 days. And that's interesting. That's a long time. IBM, but it's similar to IBM's findings from a few years ago that said that dwell time is 397 days, and that's an average. And I'm familiar with statistics. It's not the median, and so an average is not necessarily the middle. But if you think about it kind of like that, that average, so that means a breach. So a couple of high-profile breaches from recently, as of this recording, recently here, they're saying that the breach actually occurred 2 to 3 years prior to the detection a couple weeks ago. Well, that was the disclosure a couple weeks ago. The detection was before that. But a couple of years. Do you have logs that go back a couple of years? And certainly forensics. When you are breached, you should call an incident response team, somebody that can do digital forensics. And the forensics folks can find other ways of tracking down how long it's been since they breached the environment, date stamps, last access times on files, things like that. But logs are really helpful. And if you've got those logs and they're protected, but the problem is, that's good. The problem is that in the cloud, you have to pay for that, and so this is actually a big argument for a separate IDP as well for your infrastructure, because the logging volume would be less and you can keep those logs a lot longer there too. So just, again, stuff to think about. Number 10, if you're using Entra ID, please disable the seamless SSO and disable the self-service password recovery or password reset for administrators. And you might say, well, I've got it off for tenants. Well, I've been doing some reading on this, and Entra ID tenant administrators have it on by default. Even if you didn't configure it, even if you don't have SSPR on for your whole tenant. And if you do have SSPR turned on and policies set, it doesn't follow the default policy. It actually allows for email and SMS resets. And that's dangerous. So disable that. We'll talk about this in a couple minutes here, but you cannot let anybody else, you cannot let administrators reset their own passwords. If they lose their password, they need to come face to face somehow with you, and you need to make sure that they're really them and to reset their stuff. Number 11, audit your infrastructure IDPs against best practices. Hopefully your infrastructure or your IDP helper, the person coming from that team that's joining your team for these sorts of things, can help you with this. Look up the best practices. Include your IDPs in a penetration test. Penetration tests are useful and worth doing from time to time if you've got things to protect. Lower your authentication token lifetimes. I already mentioned the ability to recover an authentication token. So authentication tokens, you're basically, when you log in, you're trading a username and password knowledge and a number from an authenticator, like a one-time password thing. You trade that to the system for a cryptographic token. And it's got a lifespan, and attackers love to steal these things. There's been cloud breaches. Microsoft had a pretty severe cloud breach because attackers were able to recover an authentication token from a memory dump from a developer and one of their own developers, and that's rough, And so protecting against that is hard. I mean, people still need to be able to do debugging and things like that, but if you can reduce those lifespans, and these things get caught in backups, and I mentioned that earlier. You could restore a backup and then maybe scan it for authentication tokens, things like that. And so reduce these tokens. This sort of thing might drive the rest of your organization nuts. So again, another good argument for having a separate IDP for your environment, for your infrastructure, where you can lower these things. And us admins, we're not thrilled by it either. Don't get me wrong. But we understand with great power comes great responsibility. We understand why it needs to happen that way. So, again, it's a balance. But the balance for people with privileged access to things, that balance is a lot different than the normies out in your organization that are just using their desktops to do Word docs and things like that. Don't connect your systems, any systems that can alter accounts, alter passwords, alter authentication configurations to your infrastructure or your IDPs. These are attack vectors. And these are things like user provisioning systems. Heard of a breach once, organization that had asked me about creating, and had created a separate IDP for themselves for infrastructure. They attached all the same stuff to it. And they attached their user provisioning system. They attached, which is part of their HR system, they attached automated password resets and configuration management. Well, that's just the way we do things here. No, that's a lot of trust. Now you've got the same problem as before, except now you've got two of them to manage it. You've gone the wrong way, in my opinion, and they went, oh, and scratched their head, and they fixed it. That's actually not a breach that I was thinking of. They fixed it, and that's good. But don't do that stuff. So a configuration management system, anything that pushes commands out to run and can do so as root. A configuration management system is root or administrator. All these things, they're dangerous. So steer clear of them. Monitoring systems, too. Don't connect your monitoring systems in a way that lets those monitoring systems define what commands they can run. And a lot of monitoring systems do that. And so somebody on the back end, well, what's the harm in that, Bob? Well, the monitoring system might be running as root or something, or might have pseudo rights to execute commands, and so they just change the command to do something malicious. They change the command on instead of checking to see if disk space is free, a certain amount of disk space is free. Now they call net user and reset the administrator password. That's bad news too. Unfortunately, not hypothetical things that I'm talking about. And so you might say, how are you going to manage your system? Or your boss might say, how are we going to manage these systems? Well, you're going to do it the old-fashioned way, through manual sysadmin work. Just be careful. Anything automated that you can use, anything that you trust can be used to attack you. And so that's my main point here. You're going to manage these systems. Hopefully, this is just a small number. These are exceptions to the rules. And they're exceptions because of the importance, the blast radius of a breach there. If something goes wrong, the blast radius is huge. And so you want to contain that. And so you're going to manage them perhaps manually. There's pros and cons to that as well. But that's where you need some process too, especially if you're not attaching them to automated things that will patch them, and that you are going to need to patch these infrastructure components yourself, and so it becomes a task, who's doing it this month. And maybe it's a rotating task. Maybe you put it in the calendar and you run through a checklist every month and sign off on it. That sounds boring. That sounds awful. But I don't know. Actually touching things yourself is kind of refreshing at times. I will just say that. This is an important one, don't allow staff outside your administration team the ability to reset infrastructure administrators, authenticators, passwords, MFA stuff. I mentioned this earlier. Reset those authenticators in person for privileged accounts. And in person does not mean a Zoom call. It does not mean the deep fakes are a real thing too. And this seems like movie plot sorts of things, but that's a deep fake stuff. There's stuff in the news. There was a CFO that was conned out of a whole lot of money through a deep fake emulation of an AI emulation of somebody that looked just like normal video, and can you trust it? And so in person, be able to reach out and touch them, and if that can't happen, if you've got a remote team or whatever, maybe you need a safe word. Maybe you need a shared secret among your team that you can authenticate, or maybe you've got personal information about somebody. I had this situation happen a number of years ago, and the guy that I asked, hey, can you reset my password? And he's like, how do I know it's you? And I'm like, what? You don't trust random people calling you on the internet here? And he laughed, and he's like, what's my wife's name? And I'm like, you're gay, you have a husband. And he's like, oh, you pass, and so the, just stuff like that, and something to think about, a shared secret to authenticate the rest of your team to each other, and then you change it once in a while. Might be a good idea for a lot of different reasons. So, the other scary thing is, so I mentioned earlier that attackers are calling the help desk and getting the help desk to reset passwords. Attackers are also impersonating help desk staff, and they're emailing your users to get them to install malware, and they even say like, we've lost contact with your desk or with your workstation, and if you don't resolve this within 24 hours, this will be escalated to your director, and all this stuff. You need to run this thing. How do your users know not to actually follow those instructions? Oh yes, we've gone through our annual security training. Okay, well, how would they know if the real help desk is emailing them? That's the question. And how does this answer change? So some of these groups, the BRICKSTORM attackers, for example, sit and lie in wait. They're just snakes in the grass, basically, in your organization, just surveying the situation. They're the ones shorting your stock. When somebody 2 days ago, 2 days before your earnings report, made a huge short of your stock, and you go, who was that? It was, maybe you should think, maybe you've got a breach. Maybe there's somebody in the environment that you don't want, because attackers don't follow SEC rules, they're criminals, and so, but they've got information. They know who's talking to who. They've been watching your email. They can impersonate you. And now with AI tools, it's easy to do that. They don't misspell things. They can make fake things look just right, fake web pages look just right. So if attackers have this information, how does that change authenticating the help desk? And perhaps the answer is the help desk just will never email anybody, that sort of thing. But I don't know. That doesn't seem feasible either. Last one on my list, kind of a softball. Well, maybe. Consider carefully where you're storing your break glass authentication information. Root and administrator at vSphere.local. Those are important, and you're going to need them once in a while. And we're working on reducing that, but you're still going to need them once in a while. So you got to keep them safe, but not so far away that you can't get to them again. And you need a way to know that somebody accessed them. So writing them down on a piece of paper, that doesn't help the access thing. If you hide it somewhere, how would you know? Safety deposit box seems interesting. I used to have one of those for my environments that we'd store backups of critical things and whatnot. But would I know if somebody who was authorized went over there and accessed it? It's the people that are authorized that are being used, their accounts and their authorizations that are being used to breach stuff. It's not just a brute force attempt anymore. And that old adage that attackers don't break in, they log in, that's even more true nowadays than it's ever been. So, all right, I promise some non-technical topics, and I won't dwell on these things, but when you try to change an organization, you're going to encounter some resistance, some organizational resistance. Change is hard for a lot of organizations, and in an organization, there's basically a bell curve of people that are willing to accept change, the acceptance of change. There's some people that are all about change. I love change. Chaos is my middle name, all that sort of stuff, and that's great, and it's usually a very small group. They get labeled loose cannons and all that sort of stuff. Those people, those are the ones that like change and are okay with it, and you need those in your organization. They're fine. There's a middle group. The bulge of the bell curve there is people that are generally willing to accept change. They don't like it, but they'll put up with it, but you need to help them through it. And then there's this long tail of people that hate change and just will fight it. And so you'll get stuff like, this is not how we do things around here, Bob. Not that I'm bitter about that, but maybe I am a little bit, or we've always done it this way. Well, attackers have evolved their capabilities, and so the way you've been doing it might need to change to meet the problem at hand. Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, it's broke. We're trying to say that, old ways of doing things are broken, and so... Well, we don't have staff time for this. Well, that's a legitimate concern, absolutely. The other stuff, whatever. But the not having staff time. But I would say, do you have staff time to recover from a breach? Do you have staff time to deal with it when it's an emergency? Because attackers don't file change records. They're not going to tell you when the stuff is happening, and so. And you're going to pay a lot more in staff time than you would to be proactive about it. And then why do you think you're special, Bob? Well, I am special because the stuff I run is way more important than an individual desktop. It's a basket and it's got a lot of eggs in it. And so we need to protect it very well. That's why I think I'm special. Yes, my mother was right. But yeah, or maybe she wasn't. Who knows? But ownership. So ownership is an important thing too. Who's going to maintain? So maybe on paper, maybe in theory, people are okay with these ideas. Well, we'll isolate, but who owns that? Well, I would posit that the VCF team, the infrastructure admin team, should own the IDP and probably fund it, because anybody funding it basically owns it, and so should probably fund it there. And maybe you need a license for it, whatever, but your separate IDP should not be owned by the IDP, the normal corporate IDP team, just because they would, people forget why you do things, and that's an organizational problem. All organizations forget why you chose to do something. And having that separation organizationally will force people to remember why you did that, so that the IDP team doesn't just hook your IDP up to all of the other systems. Oh, this is different and we don't like different. So, yeah, it's different and it needs to be different. So just some thoughts. And then exceptions. So, when it comes down to telling people no about logging in, well, what about logging into vCenter and things like that? Well, what about app admins that need access? Well, why would they need access? Well, or InfoSec. InfoSec will need admin rights. You're not exempt from the rules. You're not exempt from least privilege and all that stuff. Why do you need access? Well, the scanner needs root. Oh, the heck it does. And do not let scanners have root access. Do not let scanners have administrator access, because then that's another attack vector. It's a way in. And it's often those things in InfoSec. It's the cobbler's children's shoes sort of thing, where like the InfoSec systems are often some of the most ragtag things around. As I'm not trying to be mean or whatever, but they just don't get the level of attention, because InfoSec they have isolation too. They want to maintain that. And there's good reasons for that. But yeah, just say no, and saying no, somebody's going to need to say no, because you're going to hear all these excuses. Well, just in case, or I need the console, or, I don't want to have to wake you up in the middle of the night. Well, let's worry about that when we get there. If somebody does actually need the console, just remember that these people are trying to solve a problem too, and they just don't have the same tools in their toolbox that you do, and so you may need to just set a policy, have a pre-existing written policy that you can use. And that pre-existing written policy, you can include application controls and standards. You can include a design review. If you're asking for this stuff, we're going to take a look at your application to see if there's a different way we can do this. We want to help you. We're all on the same team here. We want to help you figure this out, but we don't want to compromise our own boundaries here too. Maybe you decide that there's no way around it. I had a fire alarm system that we virtualized back in the day, and virtualization for that thing was great. Lots of benefits, snapshots, all that stuff. But it was old and it could not be made into a service. Somebody had to log into the console. And so, okay, you get your director to sign this thing saying that you're authorized every year or whatever, and then we'll let you in. And we had people that would do it, and so you need to be prepared. This is not, it'll get rid of a number of the requests, but it might happen. And you got to remember that these systems don't belong to you. They belong to the organization, and the organization is telling you that they've made a decision. That's fine. Just get it in writing that, so that when this person turns out to be a North Korean IT worker, you've got it in writing that their director let them in. And again, I've mentioned this a number of times. Self-service is absolutely wonderful. VCF Automation is wonderful. If you do have this sort of thing, check VCF Automation out in VCF 9 and future releases. It's evolving. It's actually pretty cool. And so the promise here is the vision for it. I really like the vision for it, especially from a separation perspective. So that's it. That's a lot of stuff. And I've got a GitHub repository. You can scan this QR code, or if you're not somebody who likes QR codes, then this is doubly offending to you, because it goes to that redirector, which is bit.ly underneath, and which goes to the GitHub repository. But if you want to go there just directly, you can go to our VMware GitHub repository, search for a repo named security. You'll get two things, the dysstigs and my stuff here. And I'll put the slides out there. There's a directory. I think there's a directory already called presentations. And so I'll put the slides out there. so that you can find a copy of them. So thank you very much. I appreciate you greatly. I'm hoping that you're staying secure. Like I said in the beginning, if you could like and follow the VCF channel, like this video, thumbs up, not thumbs down. Oh, thumbs down bad. Thumbs up good, you know, and so, but I just hope you're staying safe and that some of these things were useful for you. So take care of yourself and your environment. Good luck.